Hello, boys and girls. Welcome to the Ministry of Education and Partners COVID-19 Teaching by Radio program. The Ministry of Education and Partners COVID-19 Teaching by Radio program is a 30-minute radio intervention support program that is meant to provide continuous instruction to keep you academically engaged during this stay-at-home period, as well as preparing you, our 6th, 9th, and 12th graders for the pending Liberia Primary School Certificate Exam, Liberia Junior High School Certificate Exam, and West Africa Senior Secondary Certificate Exam when the time comes. Also, in addition to this academic support, the program is meant to provide psychosocial support for learners, teachers, and parents, and also tips on how you as parents and teachers can provide support to your students and children at home. Now, let's join our teacher for today's lesson.
Hello, fellow listeners and students. Welcome to Teaching by Radio, a program for COVID-19 sponsored by the Ministry of Education and Partners. For today's lesson, we'll be discussing history in the senior high division. And our topic is the First Liberian Civil War from 1989 to 1997. Upon listening to this topic, you will get to learn and discuss the First Liberian Civil War, identify the essential players in the Liberian Civil War, and the role of ECOWAS. You will also discuss the interim government of national unity. You'll be able to analyze the performances of the Liberian traditional governments up to 1997. And of course, you will analyze the positive and negative effect of the war on the elderly, young adults or children, and even the disadvantaged people in our society. As we prepare to begin this lesson, we want to appeal to you that you get a pencil or pen along with a notebook and invite a classmate or friend to listen along with you in this discussion. Once again, welcome to the history lesson with the title, The First Liberian Civil War, 1989 to 1997. The period mentioned above, 1989 to 1997, is the most troublesome period in the history of Liberia. It was a time when justice versus injustice, brutality, cruelty, and mayhem. A period in which power and authority were vested in the barrel of the gun, corruption, pillage, dishonor, and total disregard to the laws or constitution. This bitter period is very difficult to discuss due to the uncivilized nature of human behavior introduced into Liberia at that time, when the Liberian people were gaining some symbolisms of enriched education, political awakening, and gaining some rights and freedom to participate in the border politics. The Civil War was a complete turning point in the history of Liberia and our national existence. Man in humanity to his fellow man was so prevalent to the extent that the world wonders why Liberians are fighting a civil war. The history of the Civil War has its roots planted in many tributaries of political history. First, it was clear that West Africa has had more than its share of military coups. In the 1960s and 70s, those years were the decade of coups in West Africa. Once coups started, they began like a wild Hamilton bushfire, sweeping through the entire sub-region. The coup syndrome began in Togo in January of 1963. The military at that time deposed and killed President Savanos Olympio. On the other hand, here in Liberia, The tripartite rule of Liberia for over 100 years was like a challenge many enlightened educators, politically weary but socially and morally fit Liberians who built up movements to intellectually and politically challenge the situation through various social, political, and mass-based movements. All of these uprisings and political advocacies and the desire to mobilize power in the hands of few elites of the Liberian society led to what is known in Liberia as the 1980 coup. Hence, on April 12, 1980, a group of non-commissioned officers of the AFL, that is the Armed Forces of Liberia, led by Master Sergeant Samuel Kayan Doe, forced their way into the executive mansion and shot dead the president. I'm talking about President William R. Talbot Jr. Note carefully, according to political advocates, the sluggishness in carrying out reforms in Talbot administration became the impetus for citizens to seek solace in the feeble tales concocted by Mr. Gabriel Bacchus Matthews and others of the Progressive Alliance Party of Liberia against the president, that he, President Talbot, was engaged in corruption, nepotism, and price hiking for personal benefits. The public disenchantment that ensued triggered public protest. I know you heard about the April 14, 1979 Rest Riot or Rest Protest, which became the predicate for the group of enlisted men or enlisted officers of the AFL to violently dismember the president in a coup d'etat. The coup makers organized themselves under the banner of the People Redemption Council or PRC. That's how they used to call them, their organization, the PRC, People Redemption Council. The People Redemption Council adopted a revolutionary slogan: in the cause of the people, the struggle continues. And this slogan came from the PPP, which is the Progressive People's Party, or PAL, the Progressive Alliance of Liberia, led by Mr. Gabriel Bacchus Matthews. Their reasons for the overthrow was explained by many rank and file members of the PRC in a rather shallow but blunt term: to end rampant corruption and stop the increase in the price of commodities, particularly rice, unquote. The coup ended a century of long political domination by Americo-Liberians, and also ended a century-long peaceful constitutional transition that once duped Liberia, quote, one of Africa's peaceful nations. Let me repeat this. Their reason for the takeover, as explained by rank and file members of the PRC in a rather shallow but blunt term, quote, to end rampant corruption and to stop increase in the price of commodities, particularly rice. The coup ended a century of long political domination by Americo-Liberians and also ended a century-long peaceful constitutional transition that once duped Liberia, quote, one of Africa's peaceful nations. Now, what this is saying is that the People Redemption Council used that slogan, in the cause of the people, the struggle continue. Or they staged the coup was to end rampant corruption and to stop the increment in the price of commodities, especially rice. You know, in this country, rice is our staple food. The Liberian man can eat any other thing. Once he does not eat rice, he will not be satisfied. What the coup did was it ended a long year, over 100-year period of Americo-Liberians ruling this country. They also ended a long 100 years of peaceful transition, that is, from one president to the other without any trouble. That's why it ended. Now, Doe, Master Sergeant Samuel K. Doe, who was the head of the PRC, and his men ousting the government was seen as a leap of faith for indigenous people, whom for over a century had played the roles of second-class citizens, living in separate and unequal social setting. And so for that reason, when Doe and his men overthrew the Tower government, people were dancing all in the street on that day, that April 12th day. All around Monrovia, all around Liberia, people were dancing. And they were even singing the song. I think you heard that song before. Nete Woman Bonsoya or Nete Men Bonsoya. That was the song people were dancing in the streets of Monrovia and parts of Liberia when they heard that the PRC, the People Redemption Council, headed by Master Sergeant Samuel Kenyon Doe, had overthrown the Tower government and that Tower was killed. People got in the street and began to dance. And the coup plotters, or those who staged the coup, said they wanted to end corruption in Liberia, and they wanted to stop the increase in the price of commodities, especially the price of rice. The PRC, upon the advice of some members of the AFL, took the following measures. First, they suspended the Constitution of Liberia, and they were ruling by decree. Now, decrees are rules and regulations made by authoritarian people, authoritarian power, for everybody to obey. It's not a real rule of law. 2, they released leaders of the opposition Progressive Party, or Progressive People's Party. At that time, in 1980, April 12, Gary Bakwa Matthew and his friends and other colleagues were in jail. They were put in jail. They were arrested after the April 14 arrest riot. They were arrested by the Tower government and placed in prison. So while they were in jail that day, when Samuel Kenyon Doe and his people, or his men, his enlisted men, overthrew the government. So the second thing they did was to release Gabriel Bakwa Matthew and his friends. And I know some of them, as Omer, Oscar Kuya, my own friend, Deacon Carlo, and many others, were released on that day. The PRC also arrested former officials and others and charged them with treason. So what they did was they grabbed officials of Tower government, whether you were a minister, whether you were a director, and some people who were managing director and what have you, they arrested them and charged them with a crime called treason. And lastly, they established a military tribunal, a military court. A tribunal is a court. It's a court. They established a military tribunal for the prosecution of cabinet members of the defunct administration. So they set up a court to try members of the former government that they had arrested. Those people were tried through the military law, and that military law is called the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UMCJ. Even though those people that were arrested were all civilians, but they were tried under military law. They included members of the True Party. And those people, according to news, were killed on South Beach behind the Barclay Training Center by firing squad. They were 13 government officials at that time. For historical purposes, we want to list members of the PRC. Maybe you may have forgotten, or you just heard their name and you don't know actually what happened. So the first person on the PRC listing, members of the PRC, were Master Sergeant Samuel K. Doe. At that time, he was called CIC, which is in the military term, Commander-in-Chief, and he was the head of state. 2, next to Doe was Thomas Wesen. He was the deputy head. 3, Thomas G. Kuwankpa. Kuwankpa was the commanding general of the armed forces of Liberia. That was the title they gave him. 4, Major General J. Nicholas Podia. Podia was the deputy head of state after Wesen. After they eliminated Wesen, then Podia took over as deputy head of state. 5, Brigadier General Jeffrey S. Batu. He was Speaker. I think, if my memory will serve me right, Jeffrey Batu is the only living member of the PRC now as we speak. 6, Brigadier General David M.T. Keme. He was member. Colonel Jerry G. Friday Jr., member. Colonel Harrison T. Pennell, member. Colonel Abbott S. Toh, member. Colonel Abraham D. Colley, member. Colonel Joseph K. Sampson, member. Colonel Larry Botte, member. Lieutenant Stanley Chenyui Tao, member. Major Swen N. Dixon, member. Lieutenant Colonel Colansier G. Gonyo, member. Major Yele Kebe, member. Major Rabo B. Nwoku, member. Captain John Sumo Nyuma, member. Lieutenant Colonel Jacob Swen, member. Colonel Nelson B. Toh, member. Colonel Vani or Fala Vani, member. Major Rabo G. Zuo, member. And Lieutenant Colonel Afre Ze, member. Those were members of the People Redemption Council who ruled Liberia from 1980 to 1985 when the elections was held. These enlisted men were functionally illiterate and lacked the requisite leadership experience to effect real peaceful change. Let me repeat this statement. These enlisted men that I just named above were functionally illiterate and lacked the requisite leadership experience to effect real peaceful change. Barely 6 months into the PRC rule and the coup, members of the PRC became so obsessed, they were behaving like they were drunk with power and began to move against one another. General Doe, Samuel Kanyan Doe, his distrust of his comrade led him to surround himself with soldiers from his ethnic Crown tribe, appointing them to strategic government positions and at the same time alienating those who gallantly fought along with him during the insurrection. What this is saying is that just 6 months, within 6 months, when they came to power, they were all behaving drunk with power. Anything they said are law. And so General Doe himself became obsessed with power. But he was not satisfied with the behavior of his men. He became very frightened by them. So he surrounded himself with some of his tribe men. He came from the Crown ethnic group in Grand Jide County. And he appointed some of his own Crown people to strategic positions in government. And at the same time, those brothers who fought along with him to overthrow Tobo, he began to push them aside. Then the real trouble starts from this point onward. But we will discuss the details of some of the things that happened in the PRC that led to its downfall and even that brought about the Civil War in subsequent time when we are discussing the administration and contribution of President Samuel Kanyan Doe. By 1983, the entire nation was dissatisfied with Doe's suppression of political freedom and freedom of speech. The PRC began to rule by decrees. For example, Decree number 1, they used to call it Executive Order. And that Executive Order number 1 says, students' politics were banned, and no student was allowed on the campuses to organize student government. Executive Order number 12, it banned all labor strikes, and Executive Order 88 made it illegal to criticize the PRC regime. So you see, all the decrees, number 1, student politics were banned on all campuses within the Republic. Number 2, no worker, no labor man working for a private company or working for government or working for any other institution supposed to strike. And the last executive order, which is Executive Order number 88 or Decree number 88, say do not criticize the PRC regime. That PRC government, that time they were in power, don't criticize them. If they hire you, they will charge you either with treason, sedition, or any other thing just to get rid of you. Not being pleased with the level of political pressures from the PPP, that is the Progressive People Party, and MOJA, which is the Movement for Justice in Africa, Doe was technically advised by his kinsman, and my research proved, and that kinsman was Mr. John Ramsey. He advised Doe, 1, to remove all known MOJA and PPP sympathizers from the public eye through reassignment or dismissal from the government. 2, he also advised the CIC at the time, the commander-in-chief, to re-establish diplomatic ties with the state of Israel. And you know what the Israelis did in this country during the Kuwankpai abortive invasion. We will come to that in subsequent lessons. 3, he advised the CIC to adopt a shape or stance in both domestic and international arena against the Soviet policy. Now you remember during the Cold War, the whole world was divided into 2 blocks as we discussed the last time. We had a Western bloc and we had the Socialist bloc. At that time, the Soviet Union was heading the Socialist bloc. So this advisor to CIC though said, look, you got to be very careful how you will deal with people who will exhibit or present socialist idea in your government. 4, he also advised the CIC to eliminate all domestic oppositions through strategic, if possible, crush with force if necessary. So all those people that were seen as opposition at that time, from 1980 to 1983, going to 1984, CIC though was advised to crush them if he will use force if necessary. And lastly, he advised the CIC to be very careful and watchful of your friend. He said, be careful and watchful of your friend. And who that friend was? Thomas Kuwankpa from Nimba County. In his advice, he told the CIC that these people, I am convinced, he was saying to the CIC that they are troublemakers. Who are the troublemakers? Nimbayans. He said, remember, Nimba County was the strongest hold of the PPP, the Progressive People Party. He said, Nimba County was the strongest hold. When the political parties say this county is my stronghold, that means that party get more support from that country than any other place. So he advised CIC to be mindful and be very careful of the activities of Thomas Kuwankpa, who was then commanding general of the armed forces, and to be mindful of Nimba people because he said Nimba people are troublemakers. He said he was speaking from experience. He said, I am convinced that these people are troublemakers. On Christmas Eve in 1989, with the backing of Libya, Burkina Faso, and the Ivory Coast, Charles Taylor, who was also a member of the Doe government, ordered his 50-man trained special forces. These special forces were trained in Libya. He ordered them to cross into Liberia from the eastern border with the Ivory Coast to begin their campaign to remove President Doe. This campaign gained popular support. The Man and Down people are in Nimba. Locally, we refer to them as Mano people or Gyo people. And shortly, when the fighting started, it spread throughout the northeast. Taylor men pushed forward, capturing towns and villages. Immediately, when Taylor felt that he has gained some grounds, he announced to the world himself and his revolution. The death and carnage associated with this civil war or with the Civil War is indescribable, as the entire nation was now engaged in warfare based on ethnic lines, warfare based on wealth, political interest, and control of territory. The MPFL, That was the organization led by Mr. Charles Gange Taylor. When they crossed into Liberia, he announced to the world on BBC that he was indeed the head of the NPFL, National Patriotic Front of Liberia, and that the National Patriotic Front was pushing a revolutionary war against the rule of President Samuel Kanyando. There were formations of splinter groups and warring factions to protect ethnic interests and pillage the resources of Liberia. One, you had the IMPFL, you had Ulimbo J and Ulimbo K, you had Model. So the whole country was engulfed in war. And what the war was doing, it was destroying human life and destroying property, killing men, women, and children, especially young children. But as the war goes on, there was a need to ease the tension. And so to ease the growing tension, an interim administration called the IGNU, Interim Government of National Unity, was formed. And that interim administration was led by Dr. Amos Sawyer. After Sawyer, from 1991 to 1994, subsequently there were other interim administrations. But all of those interim administrations did not solve the problem for Liberia. They did not end the war. In fact, they really intensified the war. And so in 1997, weary of war, the international community hastily staged an election under extreme and difficult circumstances with the absence of freedom in many parts of the country. At the end of the polling, Mr. Charles Gange Taylor won the election under the slogan, quote, "You came a pa, you came a man, I will vote for you." And that's how the 1997 election ended. Taylor won that election according to the Election Commission under that particular slogan, "You came a man or you came a pa, I will vote for you." Taylor won popularly according to what the Election Commission announced to the world. As president proper now remember, before this 1997 election, Taylor was posing himself in his own little enclave he called Greater Liberia. The headquarters was Banga City, Bon County. He had his own government there. He even went so far and printed his own currency. His government was called NPRAG. That was not a government of Liberia that will control the entire Liberia. So this time around, he won the election sponsored by the international community for peace purposes, and then he became the president proper, sworn in by the Chief Justice. With this power, Taylor grew uncontrollable and became savagery to the international community. Taylor began to do all kinds of things. He even led his people into Sierra Leone and caused war there. And of course, the resources of Liberia was opened up to Taylor. They were taking diamond, gold, iron ore, timber, what have you. Nobody there to monitor him. He didn't stop there. He moved the war from Liberia to Sierra Leone. Then he raised eyebrow. And so he was indicted by a special war crime court for Sierra Leone and taken to The Hague, tried and convicted of war crimes against humanity, and sentenced for 50 years. On his way from Liberia, Mr. Taylor said, and I quote, "God willing, I'll be back," unquote. And so, fellow students and listeners, this will be a summary of what transpired between 1989 and 1997 that we refer to as the Liberian Civil War. As I said in the beginning, the war has so many branches. Remember, Mr. Taylor was in the Doe government as head of the government purchasing arm, GSA. And it was alleged that he stole some money and established his own company in America. The government at the time moved against him and Taylor was arrested and put into jail. But later on, Taylor escaped. How he escaped from prison in America, the great America, that is a story that historians have to untangle. But he came to Liberia, he came to Africa, he went to Libya, he went to Burkina Faso, he went to Ivory Coast, organized a group of 150 strong force soldiers, including our present Senator, Honorable Prince Johnson. He was in that force, but later on he and Taylor split. And he formed his own IMPFL. So the story is long. Fellow listeners, it's a very long story. Our time here is just 30 minutes for this class. And we hope you took some notes of the salient points that we stress. And then if you have any questions or inquiry, you can call my number and text to me or call to ask me. My number is 0886 573 114.